Kennedy's going to go to his Attorney General office, where Anatoly Dobrynin, the highest-ranking Soviet diplomat in the United States, is going to meet with him to try to get a possible solution in the crisis. And Kenneth O'Donnell is going to be the one that drives Bobby to the Attorney General's office, where Ambassador Dobrynin was there. Now, if you remember this, I'm trying to think who was here. Olivia, do you remember what Bobby Kennedy's strategy was going to be with Dobrynin? Keeping in mind that we were going to accept the letter, the first letter that Khrushchev gave, and ignore the second. So what's Bobby going to try to do with Dobrynin when he gets in there?
So he was going to kind of use that first letter and like negotiate that with him, and then if it had to come up, he was going to talk about the missing.
Very good. Kennedy's mission during the meeting was kind of twofold. If he could convince Ambassador Dobrynin to accept the offer from Premier Khrushchev's first letter of October 26, 1962. If he could not, it looked like the meeting was going to end and go without a solution, then he was going to offer the missiles in Turkey for those in Cuba. Now, if the missiles in Turkey are going to be needed to make this arrangement work, the missiles in Turkey are going to be removed privately 6 months later, after the crisis was over, so the military would not be on their backs about it. Does that make sense? They're not going to make this public, and if they do, then they're going to deny it. Well, during his short drive to the office, Kenneth O'Donnell is trying to raise the spirits of Bobby Kennedy, and he's trying to get him to relax. So Bobby Kennedy's used to waiting at the car door for whoever drives him over there to open it for him. And Kenneth O'Donnell kind of looks at him and like, well, I'm not going to open that car door for you. And he says to him, he said, forget to open a car door, you rich people. Kind of got after him a little bit in a teasing manner that he wasn't opening up his car door. Well, during the time the two men are driving to the Attorney General office, they drive by the Soviet embassy, and they see dark smoke coming out of the building's chimney. They see dark smoke coming out of the Soviet embassy's building. Anybody want to guess what that dark smoke was? Yeah, they were burning all of their documents because they thought they were going to war. They thought that there was going to be an airstrike on Cuba Monday morning, and they believed they were going to war. They didn't want any of their secret documents found in any American embassies. So as they're driving to this meeting, the Soviets are burning their documents, believing the United States and the Soviet Union are going to go to war. Well, at this time, Bobby, who normally was a very confident individual, confided in O'Donnell that he didn't think he could do this. He was not at all sure that he could make this work. He was scared to death. You think about what's in his hands. What's the balance here? If he doesn't convince Dobrynin, then we got a problem, okay? And so he's really nervous about making this work. And finally, O'Donnell responds to Bobby Kennedy by saying, "No one else would I trust Helen and the kids' lives with. No one else would I trust their lives with." Have I got something screwed up over there? Is there anybody have any extra, the Dobrynin ones I just handed out? Did I hand out too many? Slide her this way. Anybody else? Couple of them. There they are. Those other ones, save that, JC. You'll need that later. I must have them at the bottom, so save that. Okay, well anyway, it's not that difficult. Just save those other ones. This meeting between O'Donnell and Dobrynin began, and O'Donnell waited outside the office whistling up some luck for Bobby. Whistling up some luck. Anybody know where that comes from? So he sets out in front of the office while Bobby's there. What's whistling up some luck? Anybody know where that comes from? Anybody know what nationality whistles up luck? It's part of their culture. The Irish. There we go. So he sits outside and whistles up some luck. Okay, take that handout I just gave you and we'll just read through this and you can see what the conversation was. Robert Kennedy starts out the conversation with Ambassador Dobrynin by saying, "My brother, my friends, my countrymen, and I cannot and will not permit those missiles to become operational. I promise you that." Dobrynin's reply to that was, "Then I fear our two nations will go to war, and I fear where war will lead us." Bobby Kennedy then states, "If the missiles do not become operational, if you remove the missiles, then there will be no war. At this moment, the President is accepting the terms of Secretary Khrushchev's letter of Friday night. If the Soviet Union halts constructions immediately, removes the missiles, and submits to UN inspection, the United States will pledge to never invade Cuba or aid others in that enterprise. So there he is. He's trying to get him to go for the first letter. Dobrynen's immediate response: if your Jupiter missiles in Turkey were removed also, such an accommodation could be reached. Bobby Kennedy says, that's not possible. The United States cannot agree to such terms under threat. Any belief to the contrary was an error. So he's testing Dobrynin. Dobrynen's response to him is, you want war? And Ambassador Dobrynin kind of shows his disappointment, and he reaches for his briefcase to leave the building. So what does Bobby have to do now? He's going to have to go to Plan B. So at this point, Bobby continues his statement with the following. He says, however, while there can be no quid pro quo on the issue, you know what quid pro quo stands for? This for that. Yeah, trading this for that. Although there can be no quid pro quo on this issue, the United States can offer a private assurance. Now, our Jupiter missiles in Turkey are obsolete and have been scheduled for withdrawal for some time. This withdrawal should take place, say, within 6 months. Of course, any public disclosure of this assurance would negate the deal and produce the most stringent denials from our government. What's he saying? We're willing to remove these 6 months later, but you better not tell anybody. Because if you tell anybody, and the military finds out, we're going to deny that, and we're going to end up going to war on Monday. That's basically what he's saying. Okay? Dobrynin then says, this private assurance represents the word of the highest authority, meaning President Kennedy. Robert Kennedy responds, yes. Dobrynin says, and it can be relayed beyond Comrade Khrushchev's ears to the top circles of my government. Who's he talking about? The military. Robert Kennedy says, our pledge can be relayed to any government official Secretary Khrushchev sees fit to satisfy, with the caveat that is not to be made public in any way, shape, or form. In other words, you can't tell what about this private assurance. This is going to happen 6 months later. And we must have an answer tomorrow at the latest. I cannot stress this point enough. Why? Because if they don't get it, the answer, what are they doing? They're airstriking, okay? Well, a relieved Ambassador Dobrynin excuses himself to give this valuable information to the Soviet government, and he says, we have heard stories that some of your military men wish for war. You're a good man. Your brother is a good man. I assure you there are other good men. Let us hope the will of good men is enough to counter the terrible strain of this thing that was put into motion. Well, just because they agree upon it doesn't mean that they're going to get word back from the Soviet Union that this is the way it's going to go. Because you can't predict what's going to happen back there when their higher circles of government and military find out about this trade, especially if they have to wait 6 months. So that night, tension grew for all members of the ExComm committee, and many members went home to spend the night with their families, waiting for a word from the Soviets, including Kenneth O'Donnell. So that night, tension really mounted. It grew for all members of the ExComm committee, and many members went home to spend the night with their families, waiting for the word from the Soviets, including Kenneth O'Donnell. Now, to be honest with you, Kenneth O'Donnell went to his home that night, and he was concerned. He expected the worst. He expected something to go wrong, and that we would end up in a nuclear war over this whole airstrike scenario and invasion. He was not optimistic. Well, you got to remember, he wasn't home much, and when he got home, his wife was a little surprised, and she asked him what was going to happen. What's going to happen? Well, he doesn't really know, right? But this is what he says to her. I just want you to listen to this quote, because I think it's an incredible quote. He says to his wife, when she asks what's going to happen, he said, if the sun comes up tomorrow, it is only because of men of good will. That is all that is between us and the devil. So basically he's saying if we don't go into a nuclear war, it'll be because people had stronger minds and could do the right thing. That decision by those stronger minds is the only thing that's going to keep the world between them and the devil. Okay, that takes us to Sunday, October 28th. So what they're going to do is spend the rest of the night waiting for a response from the Soviet Union, hoping they'll agree to the terms of that trade in private. Well, on Sunday, October 28th, Premier Khrushchev used Radio Moscow to announce that the Soviet Union had agreed to remove the missiles and dismantle the missile bases in Cuba. And using Radio Moscow would be like using the highest, most respected media outlet in the United States. Okay? If our president did that. So on Sunday, October 28th, Premier Khrushchev used Radio Moscow to announce that the Soviet Union had agreed to remove missiles and dismantle the missile bases in Cuba. With this announcement, kids, on Sunday, October 28, 1962, the Cuban Missile Crisis ends. Cuban Missile Crisis ends. Well, when the news came out, Kennedy met with his staff and ex-com. They were all very relieved. Now I want you to listen to this quote he said and tell me what you think he means by this. I want you to think about this. He said, "You know, it's been a long 2 weeks, and whatever, I'd like to thank you all. I think you all did a great job. But I don't think we should be gloating too much. It was just as much a victory for them as it was for us." What's he mean by that, Ivan? What's that? No one won anything, but more importantly, no one lost anything. We didn't end up going to a nuclear war. They're celebrating in the Soviet Union just as much as we have. It was just as much a victory for them as it was for us because we didn't end up in a nuclear war which would kill millions of people. Well, President Kennedy excused himself in his office and he dictated a letter. Now, in those days, he used a dictaphone, and basically what it was is the president had his machine look like a telephone, and he would talk into it, and it would go into the earpiece of Evelyn Lincoln, his secretary, and as he spoke, she would then type the letter that he was writing. Okay? It was kind of an interesting scenario in those days. Anybody know what the letter was about? Anybody want to guess? Anybody want to figure out who he was writing a letter to immediately after the crisis? I'll be really impressed if somebody gets this. No? No?
The guy who came up with negotiators.
No?
The New York Times.
No, you're all, these are good guesses. Think about it on more an emotional state. Who's he writing the letter to? Nope. Nope. Emily? What'd you say?
Is it his dad?
Nope.
Wait, is it like the guy who got stuff?
That's right. Not him, but to Rudolph Anderson's parents. Kennedy excused himself and he dictated a letter to Rudolph Anderson's mother and father. And will later dictate one to who? His wife. Yep, that's what he does. So he excuses himself to his office after his quote, where he dictates a letter to Rudolph Anderson's mother and father. Back in his office, Kenneth O'Donnell is just relieved but stressed out, and he picks up a paperweight from his desk with a quote that I think maybe sums up this entire 13 days. He picks up a paperweight from his desk, and here's what's on the quote. You might want to write this down. This is what was on the quote. "O God, thy sea is so great, and my boat is so small." O God, thy sea is so great, and my boat is so small. And I think that quote of, "O God, thy sea is so great, and my boat is so small," may have been the way all involved on both sides may have summed up the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962. Great big ocean, tiny little boat. And what things you have to do to survive. Now, let's talk about the results of the Cuban Missile Crisis. The results of the Cuban Missile Crisis. In the end, the Cuban Missile Crisis becomes very important for the United States for three reasons. Even though it was stressful, the Cuban Missile Crisis becomes very important for the United States for three reasons. First of all, in the minds of American citizens, this bold action on the part of President Kennedy made up for the disastrous Bay of Pigs. Okay? In the minds of American citizens, this bold action on the part of President Kennedy concerning the Cuban Missile Crisis makes up for the disaster at the Bay of Pigs. Gives Americans more confidence in their president. The second thing, or the second reason why the Cuban Missile Crisis was important for the United States is the result of the crisis gave the entire country the uplift it needed because of our scare about what? The C word. Communism. We're always worried about communism. So what it did, the result of the crisis gave the entire country the uplift it needed towards communism. And the third reason why the result of the Cuban Missile Crisis was important to the United States is the result showed citizens that the United States could stand toe-to-toe with the Soviet Union. Because we were always a little bit worried about that, weren't we? It proved to American citizens we could stand toe-to-toe with the Soviet Union. And if you stand toe-to-toe with the Soviet Union, what else do you stand toe-to-toe with? Communism. Okay? Now, this is kind of interesting. According to historians, President Kennedy's handling of the Cuban Missile Crisis was the greatest example of crisis management in the history of this country. According to historians, President Kennedy's handling of the Cuban Missile Crisis was the greatest example of crisis management in the history of the United States. Historians will tell you that the wisdom he used and the judgment he used during this crisis was the best ever by an American president in the history of this country. So according to historians, President Kennedy's handling of the Cuban Missile Crisis was the greatest example of crisis management in the history of the United States, and his wisdom and judgment used during that crisis is seen as the best ever in the history of our country. This is kind of sad in a way. On June 10th, 1963, just 5 months before his assassination, on June 10th, 1963, just over 5 months before his tragic assassination, Kennedy gave one of his greatest speeches ever at American University in Washington, D.C. On June 10th, 1963, just 5 months before his tragic assassination, President Kennedy gave one of his greatest speeches ever at American University in Washington, D.C. It went down in history as the peace speech. The peace speech. I'm going to show it to you tomorrow. Now, the main purpose of his peace speech at American University in Washington, D.C. on June 10, 1963, is Kennedy wanted to change American attitudes towards the Soviet Union. And he wanted us to have less of a conflicting relationship with the Soviets than we had in the past. I'll read a couple of more memorable quotes from the speech. He said, and you'll get to see this tomorrow, "What kind of peace do we seek? I'm talking about genuine peace. The kind of peace that makes this life on earth worth living. Not merely peace in our time, but peace in all time. Our problems are man-made, therefore they can be solved by man. So let us not be blind to our differences, but let us also direct attention to our common interests, and by the means by which those differences can be resolved. And if we cannot end our differences, at least we can help make the world safe for diversity." But here is the best quote. "For in the final analysis, our most basic common link," that's between everybody in the world, "is that we all inhabit this planet, we all breathe the same air, we all cherish our children's future, and we are all mortal." That was a great speech to try to get people to understand that we need to start working with the Soviet Union rather than against them. Well, this is kind of interesting. For the first time and only time in world history, a speech by an American president was covered on the most influential newspaper in Russia, the Pravda. They had Kennedy's peace speech at American University on June 10, 1963. That speech was on the front page of the most prevalent Soviet newspaper, Pravda. First time and only time to that point in American history did an American president's speech ever make the front page of a Soviet newspaper. Now, I would hope that a question in your mind might be, why did the Soviets place missiles in Cuba in the first place? Did that ever cross your mind? you're figuring it out. That's why I saved this to the end. Now let's give you a little history. I don't want you to write any of this down. I just want you to listen. And if you want to write it down, you can get it off the video. In April of 1962, Premier Khrushchev and one of his generals were walking along the beaches of the Black Sea in Russia that faced the country of Turkey. And Khrushchev and the general discussed the American missiles that were located in nearby Turkey. They knew about it, okay? And Khrushchev began to realize the United States was surrounding the Soviet Union with nuclear missiles. At this time in history, the United States had approximately 5,000 missiles compared to the 300 that Russia had in their military. 5,000 to 300. And Premier Khrushchev had studied the failed Bay of Pigs invasion, and he knew what the American intentions in Cuba were. What were our American intentions in Cuba? Kenneth O'Donnell said it in the video. He said, well, let's bomb the hell out of them. You know you want to. You know it'd make you feel good. We were trying to bomb Cuba or take over Cuba well before Kennedy was in office. Well, because of this fear that the Americans would make their intentions upon Cuba, Khrushchev wanted to use Cuba with the same intention that the United States was using Turkey, placing nuclear weapons there. So in May of 1962, Cuba and Russian officials met to discuss the probability of putting nuclear missiles in Cuba. And during their multiple-day meeting, Cuban leader Fidel Castro agreed to allow the missiles to be placed in his country. Well, this Soviet operation of placing nuclear missiles in Cuba would have the code name Anadar, named after a Siberian city. So in July of 1962, when did the Cuban Missile Crisis happen? October, right? In July of 62, 85 Soviet ships left Russia, carried Russian soldiers,